Let's start by clarifying what we mean by colonialism and imperialism. What's the difference between the two? What types of colonialism can we identify, and which of them are playing out in Russia's invasion of Ukraine and other countries? This conversation is not purely academic. It helps us better understand what's happening today and what might happen tomorrow. Russian colonial and imperial practices sometimes resemble those of other empires, but at other times they differ significantly. Russia often masks its imperial violence with nationalist mythology. It's important to reveal why that mythology is misleading and dangerous. You're listening to the Explaining Ukraine podcast. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. I am a Ukrainian philosopher, editor-in-chief of UkraineWorld, and president of PEN Ukraine. My guest today is Botakoz Kassymbekova, a renowned scholar of Eastern Europe and Central Asia. She's currently professor of Eastern European history at the University of Zurich and specializes in Soviet history, Stalinism and post-Stalinism, and Russian imperial practices. She holds a PhD from Humboldt University of Berlin. Explaining Ukraine is produced by UkraineWorld, an English-language media project about Ukraine, run by Internews Ukraine. This episode is created in partnership with the Ukrainian Institute, the country's leading cultural diplomacy institution. Before we begin, a quick reminder, you can support our work on Patreon. Your support is essential as we rely heavily on crowdfunding. You can also help us fund volunteer trips to frontline areas in Ukraine, where we support both soldiers and civilians. Donations are welcome via PayPal. All links are in the episode description. So let's begin. Botakoz Kassymbekova, welcome to this podcast.
Thank you, Volodymyr, for the invitation, and I'm glad to be here.
Thank you very much for this conversation. So, let me ask you the first question. I've read a couple of your texts and I've listened to a lot of your interviews, and there is of course, a recurrent topic that you're trying to combat the idea that Russia is not an empire. And of course, this is something in common with the way how you think and how the Ukrainian scholars and philosophers like me think. So, why do you think that Russia is an empire? Why do you think that we can and should apply the framework of imperialism and colonial studies to Russia?
Well, yes, that's a very good question. And Russia is definitely an empire until 1917. Russia presented itself as an empire, as a European empire. This is something that the monarchy was proud of. But to think about contemporary empire or empireness of Russia, I think it is useful to differentiate between terms like colonialism and imperialism, to understand what is imperial and what is colonial in Russia today. So if we look at these kind of classical historical works that differentiate between colonialism and imperialism, colonialism is something, is a rule, is foreign rule with representatives on the spot, which means that, for example, if a country invades another country and it replaces the local administration and laws and sends its own envoys, emissaries, or representatives from the metropole to rule in these colonized territories, these people who the new administrators, for example, governors, they were called previously in the 19th century, these are called men on the spot. So if we colonize a territory, and then very important is that we kind of try to weaken and then finally destroy and replace local laws, local self-governance, administration institutions, bring our own laws, and metropolitan laws are more important than local laws, but also we have men on the spot, we have our people who are the most important kind of decision makers. This is colonialism. Imperialism is the claim, is the ability, or is the process of intervening into affairs of another country for national interests or for regional domination or for global domination. So one doesn't have to colonize another country, but one can interfere into elections, one can hold kind of economic power in this country so that you kind of can have influence on economic and political affairs, but you don't necessarily send men on the spot, you don't build up a local administration, and you don't really interfere into internal affairs. You're not interested in that. You're simply interested in the fact that these people or this kind of polity, it could be an emirate, it could be a nation state, that they are something like protectorates or in kind of something like countries that are very dependent on you and that will ally with you. So Russia, in order to use this kind of or disguise this imperial policy, call it countries of which are in the sphere of influence. So you can do imperial politics and you can be imperial but not colonial. So a nation can act imperially, can interfere into affairs of other countries or in regional politics somewhere else. But a colonial empire can be simply, of course, in terms of Russia, it is both kind of, it's a colonial empire, but it's also an imperial empire. So if we look at the invasion of Ukraine, it has both colonial and imperial goals. Colonial goals is what has happened in the occupied territories, is we do send men on the spot, we do replace local kind of structures and governance and replace people and ideology. At the same time, it will not stop in Ukraine. One needs Ukraine in order to bully other European countries, and Russia goes westward, which means Russia will not have invading wars in Central Asia or Caucasus. It's not that important, Southern Caucasus or Far East, simply because Russia sees its road to this kind of global superpower status when it controls or when it can bully Western Europe. So the goal is actually Europe, and of course Ukraine is crucial there, but also Baltic states and Poland as well, of course. Russian Russian invasion of Ukraine is both colonial and also imperial, and it is colonial and not imperial. So one really needs to have Ukraine not simply as Belarus, as a pawn, but rather as really colonial periphery, where kind of Moscow dictates politics and Moscow dictates economics and everything, simply because, of course, Ukraine is seen as heartland of the empire. For example, when I teach Russian colonialism in Ukraine, one of the first questions I ask students to think about is, imagine a Central Asian or a person from an African continent or, from India coming to Kiev and seeing this magnificent city, right, European city. And so I ask, how would you explain that this beautiful city that actually looks like a European metropole, colonial metropole, is actually on the territory of a colonized nation? And so, yes, there is this kind of superficial difficulty, but if we take a structuralist approach and if we operate with definitions, with kind of more or less kind of classical definitions of colonialism, imperialism, it really does make sense, and it's not. There are less contradictions than one would expect. It's a very long answer to the first question. I don't know if I responded to your first question, but yes, please.
It's a very long answer because the topic is very, very interesting and very complicated. And it's precisely, I wanted to talk about these complications. I wanted us to a little bit put a more critical view on these concepts of imperialism and colonialism. And one of the ways how I think about this is also the differences between different types of empires. For example, the approach of maritime or sea empires, so overseas empires, and the approach of continental empires are different. In my thinking, the overseas empires usually work by the concept of difference. And here comes the idea of race, because the colonizer says to the colonized that you're different than me, you will never become the same as me. While the continental empires like Russia, they often function through the idea of sameness. And they're saying, colonizer is saying to the colonized that you're the same as me and you should identify yourself with me. I think you're also working with trying to make these differences, and your concepts are extractive empires versus precisely the settler empires. Can you elaborate a little bit on these differences?
Yes, of course. So the classical kind of differentiation between these two types of empires are important in understanding the logic of colonization and of colonial rule. However, very often, these are most of the empires are mixed type of empires. So we have kind of both extractivism and settlerism, but it is very useful to differentiate between kind of settler colonial empires or territorial empires, land empires, and overseas empires. And so Russian empire is a land empire, right? And kind of settlerism, settler colonialism was a very important and crucial factor for the expansion of the empire, for colonization, but also for keeping the colonial rule. Patrick Wolf, who introduced kind of this difference, explained that when kind of a settler colonialism takes place, what the colonizers are interested, they're interested in controlling the territory. They're more interested in the territory than in the local population, than in the enslavement of the local population for extractivist goals, for their labor. And here, important is not kind of natural extractivism, but it is exactly the labor. So he explains that if we look at this dichotomy land versus labor, then we can understand a lot of important differences between those kind of empires. So he gave an example of the United States, and he says, well, let us look at this, and the United States is kind of in historical literature widely acknowledged and accepted as a settler colonial empire. And where settlers came because they were interested in building their new home, right? So they were interested in land rather than enslaving the native population for example, growing cotton. But he says, let us look at indigenous people, Native Americans, what we call today as kind of a representative of the First Nations or Native Americans, and African Americans. And he says that settlers had, colonial settlers had different policies towards these two types of people. And by looking at the difference between policies towards them, we will understand the difference between these two types of empires. So, or logics of two types of imperial governance. So, African Americans, the former slaves, African slaves, they were deported people, so they lost their land. They were not natives in Northern America. So colonists, of course, rule them through this concept of difference. So there was racial segregation. They were not considered as citizens, and there was this one blood of black blood rule, which means that if in certain places, like 38 generations back, there is one black ancestor, a person would be considered as black. There was a recent article where a woman who considered herself as white, she was blonde and blue-eyed, she came to receive documents, and then in her ID, her race was black, and she was surprised and thought that it was a mistake. But actually, she was explained that she has several generations back, she had a black person, and according to the state administrative laws, she was considered as black. So, Patrick Wolf explains this logic by the fact that because African slaves were not natives, they were labor. They were considered as labor, and of course, settlers were interested in the expansion of the population of slaves, because the more slaves you have, the better it is for the colonizers. So this is why we have this rule. However, for Native Americans, the settlers were interested not in the labor, but in territory. So the policy was generally that if a settler marries or has a child with a Native American, then the child is considered as white. And the reason for that is that because one is not interested in the labor but territory, then you expand the white population, you expand the settler population, and the land then becomes goes in to the settlers and not to natives. So if we colonize territory for territory, because we're interested in this kind of territory, then we assimilate these people, we make them, we give them the identity of the colonizers. However, if we are interested in labor extraction, and African slaves they were not on their native lands, so they would not defend their territory, they would not fight for their territory, they were simply used as labor. So one didn't have to assimilate them. On the contrary, one was not interested in their assimilation. One wanted to keep this difference to them, and one created this whole racism is part of that, keeping the difference between these two groups. And if we look at the Russian Empire, we will see that this kind of process of making territory Russian, if we look at the strategies of colonization, of course, sending different people to populate, especially the steppe regions or the mountainous regions of Northern Caucasus, was an important part, but this happened not only kind of in the 18th century, 19th century, but also in the 20th century. One deported people from strategic regions. One calls them borderlands, but I think it's a very kind of Petersburg or Moscow-centric view. For example, Baltic states. One deported people from Latvia and Estonia, and one settled this kind of nations, these states with Russian settlers, not because they were simply borderlands and one needed to protect the borders. This is a very kind of imperial history writing. These were not borderlands, these were strategic lands that was so strategic for the Russian Empire that they were central lands, actually, geopolitically. And one does it today. One did it under communism, and one does it today. If we see in Crimea, the occupied territories, in Mariupol, settlers were attracted to the occupied, colonized lands to claim this territory Russian. And if we look at Crimea, for example, Pushkin was sent to these places. Of course, it was considered as an exile, but at the same time, he was very crucial in Russifying those places and putting them on the kind of imaginary Russian map, claiming Crimea as Russian. So it's a whole machinery that works on assimilating territories and imagining and making them Russian through literature, by sending settlers there, and by deporting people from these places. So yes, so. At the same time, when we talk about settler colonialism, of course, Russia is doing settler colonization now on the territory of Ukraine, but at the same time, not a lot of people know that, for example, right now in the Russian Federation, we have 21 republics with their own parliaments, with their own constitutions. Very often they are described as ethnic minorities, but it is very important to stress that these are not ethnic minorities, these are real nations. Of course, formally, they are nations, and of course they are colonized nations, also nations under occupation. But these colonial policies are ongoing, not only outside of the borders of the Russian Federation, but also inside. So, for example, if we look at recent policies, the kind of Russification policies are ongoing, so that there are different strategies of kind of qualifying people of non-Russian background to Russian background. There are some reports, of course, one cannot do kind of official research on that, but there are indications that, for example, in schools where census is made, many children are not even asked about their background. They are simply registered as Russian. So there is kind of this statistical Russification, but also different language laws makes it impossible for these nations to practice their languages fully. And we have, I just, there was a report on kind of building prisons in Buryatia and sending panel settlers to this region. And panel settlerism was not only in Australia, it was also in kind of Northern Asia, what I call Northern Asia, but what is known as Siberia, and Siberia is considered as Russian. But if you look at this territory, it's not, it's Northern Asian territory. So every month we have, or every several months, we have new settler colonial policies that affect that huge territory inside the Russian Federation, and these settler colonial policies are ongoing.
That's very interesting and again very, very complicated. Let me ask you to reflect upon our experiences, the experience in Central Asia, in your region, in Kazakhstan, in Tajikistan that you studied, and experience in Ukraine or Belarus, because we also can find similarities and differences. Like, how do we describe, for example, the artificial famines in Kazakhstan and Ukraine in the 1930s? There is an element of extractivism, I guess, but very strange element. But obviously, it's an element like let's take the agricultural products from these lands and let's use it somewhere. But if we approach this huge crime in both these countries, in Kazakhstan and Ukraine, huge Stalinist crime, from this perspective of only extractivism, I think we will miss something, because in Ukrainian case, it's obvious for me that the goal was also to exterminate a big number of people who were carrying absolutely different set of values, which were individualistic values, peasant values, Ukrainian ethnical values, etc. And I think my hypothesis is that in Kazakhstan it was also the case, but in a different way, maybe because peasants were much more nomadic, and in Ukraine they were much more, settled peasants. But still, you have this combination between the two. And another thing is,
I think that in Central Asia, this racist element is much more present for obvious reasons, but also the assimilation element is very, very strong. And I think the key instrument of assimilation is actually language. And the language, the very idea of Russian language as the key vehicle of this assimilation and making people forget their languages, and by forgetting their languages, forgetting their culture, their memories, and their ancestors. So, despite this very clearly present racist element in Russian mindset, Russian colonial imperialist mindset with regard to the Caucasus and the Central Asia, still this assimilation element is also playing a very big role. And I think this is also the way to understand how this colonialism is present with regard to what you call the nations of Russia, not national minorities, but nations inside Russia. What would you say?
Yes, I fully agree with everything that you said, and I would like to probably talk about two or three issues. One, when we discuss kind of the difference between kind of colonization and kind of colonial rule over Ukraine and, for example, Kazakhstan, a lot of people usually ask, but there were Ukrainian settlers kind of in Kazakhstan, and there were no Kazakh settlers in Ukraine. And kind of were Ukrainians kind of the Scots, you know, of the Russian Empire, like Scottish people were in the British Empire. And I would say the following: the Scots didn't experience the Holodomor. And there is a reason for that. I would say for a lot of people, there is kind of this Ukrainian colonialism simply because some Ukrainians were also settlers in Siberia, in the Caucasus, in Central Asia. And I disagree with that because I define colonialism as a state enterprise. It's an enterprise of a polity, of a state, and as far as I know, there is no such a thing as Ukrainian colonial empire. So in one of the articles, for example, I called Ramzan Kadyrov a Russian colonial officer. So for me, kind of the settler status and colonizer status is a political status, is a structuralist status. I'm a structuralist, so I look at it structurally rather than through the concept of identity. I explain how identity is part of that kind of structural colonialism, but it's not the driving force. So, of course, in kind of the Russian imagination and in their geopolitical goals, Ukraine is extremely strategic because it's on the way to Western Europe, which Russia needs to bully in order to be a superpower. And of course, Ukrainians are then assimilated into kind of this Russian narrative, and Kazakhs are not assimilated into the Russian narratives. Nobody claims that Kazakhs are Russians, like so there is no this kind of identity colonialism. But at the same time, Ukrainians, those ethnic Ukrainians or people who were sent from Ukraine to become either panel or voluntary agricultural settlers in Central Asia, of course, are then Russian settlers. Of course, they're Russian colonizers because it's Russian colonialism that they were doing. And so because it's a political, because colonialism is a political enterprise, it's a state political enterprise, that's why it doesn't matter if, for example, we had in the 19th century, Tatars played, not Crimean Tatars, but Kazan Tatars or Astrakhan Tatars were very instrumental for Russian colonialism, and they kind of were intermediaries between kind of St. Petersburg and Central Asia. But they were Russian colonizers. They worked for the Russian Empire. The same we have for the German Balts, right? They were doing Russian colonialism, not German colonialism, once part of the Russian Empire. So it is very important for me to stress that if we take the structuralist approach, which I argue makes the most sense, then there is no such thing as Ukrainian colonialism in Central Asia. It's Russian colonialism, and many different representatives of different nations took part in that. If we look at the official documents of early Soviet presence, something that I did for my doctoral dissertation, Soviet bureaucracy differentiated between two groups of officials in Tajikistan, for example, or in other parts of Central Asia. They were divided into Europeans and Muslims. So, and who was European? Anyone who was considered as white was European, so like Ukrainians or Jewish people, but even Azerbaijanis and Georgians were classified as Europeans. And you can imagine like why Soviet officials would be kind of европейский работник, like why would they be suddenly Europeans? And they had this identity of we are bringing Europe to Asia. So it was a very colonial and imperial Soviet discourse. But the local people were not Asians, they were Muslims, because Soviet officials, like people from Tbilisi or from Moscow, didn't differentiate very often who was Uzbek, who was Kazakh, and all of these identities were fluid anyways, and kind of people didn't call themselves Uzbeks anyways. Local identities were much more complicated. People called themselves Samarkandis or Bukharis. You know, Uzbekistan didn't was created during the Soviet times. So they were simply Muslims, the local people, not us, the others. You know, Muslims stood for the others. And so the construction of all of these identities took place during Soviet times, but it doesn't mean that there was nothing before. There were strong polities with their strong identities and their strong understanding of who they are and what they want, right?
It's very interesting. It's very interesting. I'm sorry to interrupt you because I really wanted to follow up on one idea, is that, well, Russia is now famous for criticizing its European imperialism, European colonialism, the Western colonialism, and we all know these Russian ideologists who are saying we are actually Eurasia, so we are a separate civilization. But if you look very, closely to the way how Russia was colonizing Asia, in particular Central Asia, but also Siberia and other parts of Eurasia, we will see the same patterns as from the European empires, the same idea of mission civilisatrice, the same idea of bringing civilization, the same idea of bringing Europe to these uncivilized people. So Russia was actually doing the same. Would you agree?
No, I would go even further. They did not even do the same, but they actually consciously were trying to become Europe by copying these practices. So Russian Geographical Society, which was crucial for the colonial enterprise, they actually looked at the British Royal Geographical Society, and they looked up the French, and they studied colonial practices, British colonial practices, French colonial practices, and they adopted not only the practices, how to govern kind of the colonized, but also they adopted the identity of Europeans, and actually they wanted to become part of Europe, and this is why they copied them. Whereas, how to become Europe, I argue that for Russia to become part of Europe, it has to decolonize. But because Russia does not want to become part of the contemporary Europe, that's why it adopts kind of this Eurasian identity. It has to distance itself, whereas before it was trying to copy it. Today it doesn't want to copy it because it doesn't want to decolonize, and Europe is decolonized. And kind of, whereas before it's kind of colonialism was a way to become, part of kind of European powers. Today, it doesn't want to become Europe simply because Europe is not colonial anymore in kind of the most kind of formal way, and it actually criticizes colonialism.
Yeah, and I can also add a little bit of deconstruction. Well, basically, the very idea of multiple civilizations is a European idea. It doesn't come from other parts of the world. It was born during the European Romanticism, as a reaction to this idea of enlightenment that we have only one civilization. Of course, it was nourished with the way how Europeans were facing other parts of the world, and there are studies of how meeting with indigenous people in America, or looking at the Muslim intellectual tradition, or interest in the African art, or other things actually inspired those thinkers to say that we have multiple civilizations. But I'm thinking about Russia, who is saying we're not European, using the very European vocabulary for that. Let me ask about another topic. You mentioned already this idea of territory, and I think it's very important for us to understand how important territory is for Russia, because for me, it's all about territory, it's all about land, it's all about this idea of greatness. I was thinking recently that the way how this word veliki is used in Russian language, I'm not sure it's used in other languages like that, because it's certainly not used in English like that. Because if you say great, it can mean great as very big and immense, but it can also mean good. Something is good. Something is intrinsically good. Like this apple is great. You cannot say in Russian это яблоко великое, right? So greatness means something different. Greatness means super greatness. Greatness means that you're bigger than others, and therefore this mania for building a great country, for building the biggest country in the world. And I think you talk about this in one of your books, and you have this concept of empire without borders. How this constant expansion is important for Russian imperial/colonial identity. Tell me.
Yes, well, Alexander Morrison recently published a book on the conquest of Central Asia, where he shows how in 19th century we have this competition between the British Empire and the Russian Empire, and where this idea of the correlation between power, the superpower status, and territory was created. So Russia felt that any loss of territory, which means any loss in war of conquest, was considered as a hit to Russia's prestige. So, and he introduces this concept of imperial prestige, and imperial prestige was kind of the capital. It was a geopolitical capital. So the more territory you have, the more prestige you have, and the more prestige you have, the more power you can exert. So it's from one side a very physical thing, so you need to have as much territory as possible, but the metropole converts it into a political currency. So territory becomes currency. So Morrison explains how the conquest of Central Asia was not for financial resources, because Russia lost a lot of money in Central Asia or in Caucasus. These two regions did not bring money, but they were conquered for imperial prestige, because the more territory you have, the greater you are. But so, and this kind of this concept that we are the sixth part of the world, that were the biggest place in the world. It's if you look at not only kind of the Kremlin narratives, but also very often even kind of Russian intellectuals, but also policy analysts who would be considered as anti-regime, but they still very often use kind of this vocabulary. We have, for example, Vladimir Kara-Murza, who also often says this in his interviews, that this is the biggest country in Europe, or this is the biggest country. So it's if you analyze when this concept is used, we are the biggest country. It is very often used as a political currency, with a claim that we're still relevant. We should be at the table with the most powerful nations, which we should be listened to. We are in the group of players that govern the world. So to get to this stage, to say that we also decide upon global affairs, to say that one has to have the biggest territory. And so it's a very conservative understanding of politics. It's come from the 19th century. But I would also still argue that, of course, kind of Russia needed Siberia simply because of its also natural wealth. One doesn't imagine it as a place to live where you can, that's the house, that's the place where one should build a house and live and enjoy the nature. It's appropriated not in that way, but still the kind of the territorial conquest of Eastern Europe is crucial, especially because it allows to bully West European countries, and that's the aim. Because for Russia, kind of the gateway to the superpower status goes through Western Europe. One really needs to have military access. One needs to be at the borders of the European Union in order to terrorize them and exert political influence and sit and have this superpower status.
Yes, and this is a paradox of today's Russia, because on the one hand, ideologically, it says that Europe is dead and the West is dead, the West is declining, and the major economic and political pole is in Asia, and therefore Russia rather will be with China than with Europe. But at the same time, there is this past trauma of proving something to Europeans, or maybe dividing Europe once again, is very present. Let me ask you about Soviet Union, because you studied a lot Soviet Union, and for many people around the world, and it's understandably so, Soviet Union was a force of decolonization and de-imperialization, and Soviet Union was indeed supporting the anti-colonial movements in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America. But we know, people from this part of the world, how imperial Soviet Union was. And can you explain to our listeners a little bit what were the imperial and colonial practices inside the Soviet Union?
Yes. Before doing that, I would say that the reason why the Soviet Empire was not considered a colonial empire is simply because a lot of the framing when one looks at the Soviet Empire, and usually looked only at Moscow, is kind of this competition between capitalism and socialism. So a lot of researchers and scholars, when they looked at this empire, they were more interested in the issues of what are the alternatives to capitalism, rather than at what happens to different nations. And second of all, I think that one didn't have, and this is something that I saw on social media at the beginning of this full-scale invasion, a lot of people from outside of Europe asked, so why did the colonized not so much speak about colonialism, like, for example, in the United States or in Australia? And the Soviet Empire was not only kind of colonial and imperial, but it was also dictatorial. So that means that all the people who could talk and would talk about colonialism, they were silenced. So there was no freedom of speech, and because it was illiberal, yes, there was no possibility to talk about it. It was simply dangerous, and people were killed. But if we simply look structurally at the Soviet Empire, what happened after the collapse of the Tsarist Russian Empire, we have all these movements for sovereignty, for independence, and what kind of Bolsheviks had to do was, of course, something that is framed very often as simply the civil war, was actually a war of either recolonization, especially of those nations that proclaimed independence, or further colonization. So kind of for the Bolsheviks, colonialism was not the end, but the precondition for instituting a new global polity, and the goal was not only kind of the former Russian Empire, but the whole world. And of course, they saw territory as extremely important on which to build a new life. And for them, colonialism was the first step. So first of all, you recolonize these territories, and then you institute your rule. And at the kind of as part of this process, a lot of the people kind of one of the kind of propaganda tools of colonialism was to present it as friendship of peoples or indigenization campaigns. So in the book that I hope will be published soon, I explain how this concept of the friendship of people was not simply a lie, and it was not simply a propaganda. It was actually a construct that allowed colonization and colonialism, and it also has roots in the 19th century or early 20th century in the Tsarist Russian Empire, where one of the kind of colonial intellectuals and one can call him officers, Ilminsky developed this idea of colonization through the native languages and through the native cultures, where he said that we first need to, he was based in Kazan in Tatarstan and was experimenting with Altai and Kazakh people, and he explained that we need the way to colonialism is for us to, first of all, make people politically loyal to St. Petersburg, and once they kind of are politically loyal to us, then we will assimilate them religiously and linguistically. But the first stage should be kind of more ideological, and in order to win people, we first need to develop their kind of national languages. And the most effective colonization is when people, natives, do it themselves in their native languages, and they propagate St. Petersburg. So they first educated elites, co-opted them, and then tasked these elites to kind of propagate Russia and Russia as the new political center in Altai language, in Kazakh language. And then he says the next stage would be Russification. And this is what Bolsheviks did as well. So first, they kind of presented communism in Ukrainian, in Kazakh. So a lot of people think that there was kind of development of national cultures. But of course, those who would do independent or anti-communist Ukrainian culture from the start would be repressed. It's those who were kind of seen as apolitical, or those who propagated or were loyal to Moscow, they would be allowed to do kind of Ukrainian culture, propagate, do theater performances or write in Ukrainian. But it actually followed the Russian Tsarist innovation of assimilation through the native languages, but it was seen as stages. So the first stage would be some kind of indigenization, and then it would be assimilation. And if you look at the kind of theory behind that colonial policy, Bolsheviks followed it perfectly. I mean, they copied this Tsarist colonial idea. And what is important, I think, to understand is that for example, Central Asians could never decide what will be grown and how will be grown and what will be produced and what laws will be in their country. So people did not have power over their own lives during the Soviet times. So all the laws, all the plans, economic plans, political plans came from Moscow. People could not decide where they would live, where they can move, who will come and who will go. And this is crucial, and this is why it was colonial. Not only directives, political directives, economic directives came from Moscow, but also people who were important in Central Asia. Central Asians did not have a say in the most important issues. Of course, Central Asians could decide about maybe very little unimportant things that would not be crucial for their political or social or cultural life. And any expression of independent decision was harshly punished. So if we look, I think perestroika times, very often romanticized in the West as this kind of time of freedom and freedom of speech. If we look at Central Asia, for example, these were the times where of harsh repressions. If we look at the Cotton Affair or the 1986, where Kazakh students and young people went to the streets simply because Moscow sent a Russian person who did not spend a single day in Kazakhstan before to rule Kazakhstan. And so the Kazakh youth went to the streets and said, we actually want to decide, we want to choose who will be kind of the main ruler in Kazakhstan. And when they were speaking at the demonstrations, they were actually naming local leaders of different ethnic background, of German background, of Russian background, of Ukrainian background. For them, it was not an ethnic issue. For them, it was important that a person who is the main kind of ruler in Kazakhstan knows Kazakhstan, because of course, if a person is sent from Russia who has never been to Kazakhstan, he's more likely not to empathize with the local population. He's more likely to push through policies that go against the interests of the local population. When we look at the Soviet kind of presence, a lot of people immediately say, without the Soviet Union and without Moscow, you Kazakhs, for example, would not have medicine. And I would say, yes, if we look at medicine, if we look at medical provision, then let us in the statistics of health statistics, let's take into account the 40% of deaths during the starvation, Moscow inflicted starvation. These 40% of the population that were basically made die are not in these health statistics. And, you know, except for one, or except for a couple, most of the nuclear arms or testing was done in Kazakhstan, and it had a huge and has and will have huge influence on health of Kazakh people, and most of this testing took place in regions where mostly ethnic Kazakhs lived, and they were not notified. They did not know what happens to them. And can you imagine, the whole Soviet Empire was testing its nuclear arsenal in the Kazakh steppe. So, of course, the health-wise, the Soviet Union, the Soviet rule, Moscow rule, inflicted much more damage than brought any health development to the country. The same we can speak about the rest of the Central Asia, simply because cotton growing was extremely segregationist, which means that, for example, Uzbeks and Tajiks drank contaminated water, and the Soviets used Agent Orange, the kind of the chemical that was used by Americans in the Vietnam War. They used it on the cotton fields, and of course the women and children who were collecting cotton basically were inhaling these chemicals, which will have influence on the generations of Central Asians. So very often all of these kind of propaganda, colonial arguments about, you know, civilizing, bringing health, if we look really at the data, we will see that actually people could not decide about their health. People could not develop their own health system. And it is very important to understand that people say that, well, but Moscow brought modernity or industrialization, etc., but local people also had their own projects of how to develop their own countries and how they wanted to go. So it's one modernity against another modernity. I don't like the term modernity, but for the simplification of the conversation today, it is very important. So a lot of people, a lot of analysts have colonial minds, have colonial attitudes, and have even totalitarian attitudes. So for me, kind of the Bolshevik project, very often when people speak about the Bolsheviks or the Soviets, they say that, well, they were the better white people than the West Europeans. But the conversation is always around white men. So who is a better white man? And I think it's a very colonial understanding. So for a lot of kind of even North American scholars, the Russians are the better white men. We are the guilty, we are the bad white men, but the Russians are the better white men. They have a better idea. And I say, well, maybe Ukrainians and maybe Kazakhs and maybe Georgians also have their own understanding of how they want to develop themselves, how they want to rule themselves, and maybe they did not need these white saviors, a very small amount of men who decided how they will fix the world with a couple of theoretical exercises. For example, the abolition of the private property. Of course, they took it from Marx. But just because somebody has an idea how they will fix the world is a very dictatorial and even totalitarian idea that this system was supposed to be good for someone, because at the end of the day, it takes away from people their right to participate in a political process about their own futures. And so kind of the whole, I think, tragedy of not recognizing the Soviet Empire's empire is simply because those who discuss it and those who think about it themselves have imperial, dictatorial, and totalitarian lens when analyzing it. They cannot accept the fact that maybe these nations and these people, these communities, maybe it's all right for them to decide about their own lives.
Thank you. Thank you very much for saying this, and thank you for bringing it into perspective, because I think our conversation shows how deep this Russian and Soviet colonialism, imperialism are, and that Ukrainian fight is probably the most visible right now, but it's just it's one of the stories, and there are so many stories in Eastern Europe, in Asia, in Central Asia, in Northern Asia, in the Far East, in the Caucasus. And there is the whole story of the colonized nations, both outside the current Russian Federation and inside the current Russian Federation, about which we need to talk more. Botakoz Kassymbekova, thank you very much for this conversation.
Thank you, Volodymyr. Thank you.
This was Explaining Ukraine, a podcast by UkraineWorld, an English language media project about Ukraine run by Internews Ukraine. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. I'm a Ukrainian philosopher, editor-in-chief of UkraineWorld and president of PEN Ukraine. My guest today was Botakoz Kassymbekova, a renowned scholar on Eastern Europe and Central Asia, who is currently professor of Eastern European history at the University of Zurich. Let me remind you that you can support our work on Patreon. Your support is essential as we rely heavily on crowdfunding. You can also support our volunteer trips to frontline areas in Ukraine, where we provide help to both soldiers and civilians. All links are in the episode description. And I also remind you that this episode is created in partnership with the Ukrainian Institute, the country's leading cultural diplomacy institution. Thank you for listening. Stay with us and stand with Ukraine.